Hello, everyone. Time appropriate greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is ShipTalk podcast, and I'm your host, Devan Ahmed. I'm principal developer advocate at Harness, the AI native software delivery platform. And with me today, I have Brendan O'Leary, VP of Developer Relations at Prefect.io. Hey, Brendan, how's it going?
Hey, Dewan, so nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So you are a known face in the tech landscape, a known technical leader. But for those listeners and viewers who are not familiar with your work, could you please give a quick background about yourself, how you came into software industry, and then your transition into developer relations and product strategy?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I got my start in my career. I thought I was going to go into like kind of traditional IT, and then I met somebody who ran a small like bootstrapped medical software company, and I've been kind of in software ever since. Um, I spent a lot of years there and in other bootstrapped companies, and then I started working for startups when I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to join GitLab in 2017 when they were about 150-ish people. Saw it grow over the next 5 years to like 2,500 people, and was there for the IPO. It was like kind of a fantastic ride. Um, and then since then, I've gone to a couple other smaller startups. I worked for a couple of years in cybersecurity, and then most recently, as you mentioned, I'm at Prefect as the VP of Developer Relations. Much more focused in the data space. And yeah, developer relations is something I kind of got into while I was at GitLab. I say when you're at a small startup, like everyone's a part-time evangelist or developer relations person, especially in an open source startup. And then eventually, when you grew, I kind of had to specialize, and I actually got talked into it by Priyanka Sharma, who's now the executive director at the CNCF, but at the time she was at GitLab running DevRel, and for almost a year she was trying to talk me into it. And I finally said yes, and now it's what I've made my career doing, really.
What you mentioned about getting to work in companies who's growing from, let's say, A or B to C to IPO, not many of us have those opportunities. It's like sometimes called like a rocket ship, right? What are some valuable lessons for folks, maybe they're in these situations where they're at a rocket growth company hoping to go to IPO? Like, what are the lessons that you learned?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the lessons that I learned, it's interesting. GitLab, was kind of remote before it was cool or had to be, right? Like we were all remote for almost the entire life, and the entire time I was there for sure. And so 2017 was obviously before the pandemic and before kind of everyone had this idea of like, hey, what if we went remote? And I came to learn, I think, that the most important things for doing remote well are also kind of the things that companies have always aspired to do well. And so it's things like writing things down. I think it's like a superpower that people underestimate, right? But a single source of truth for documentation is something that not only helps you today, but like helps you when you're onboarding people, right? There was a time at GitLab where I had calculated that in my tenure, we had hired more than one person per working day. And so the ability for people to self-serve and find the information they needed to get their job done was like really critical. And it reduces meetings, it reduces like the like weirdness around like who's making a decision. It makes it like this effective like decision-making process. And this fast decision making is kind of the number one thing in a startup that's like really trying to scale out. And so I think that's the number one thing. And then I think with that is like giving trust and agency to a team, right? Like I say this, it kind of sounds weird, but like it's true. It's like hiring adults and expecting them to act like adults. Like there's no process and perfect world, especially in such a dynamic thing like software development, that's going to let you make a perfect process, right? But if you hire people that are smart and give them ownership over the decisions that they need to own, again, it allows you to, you know, accelerate decision making. And then I, I think lastly, um, transparency that comes along with writing everything down is really critical. The more information that you can give, again, to all these people who you're trusting to hire, the better. And then shipping with a low level of shame is like kind of the last thing. GitLab's pretty famous for this. Like ship something. And that's the advantage a startup has. Even if you're growing, you still have that advantage that you can ship faster. And so don't ever, try to never lose that advantage.
100% agreed. And I think that's something both like GitLab and Harness has in common that like get ship done is also one of the mantra of Harness. Like just get it done. You don't need to ask for permission if it's something feels right. Just and one of our leaders said is like you have to be operating at all levels. Just like let's say if
Hmm.
I own a Subway, like the restaurant, I should be able to know how to make a sandwich, how to mop a floor, how to clean the washroom, like everything I should be able to do as an owner of a Subway. In case someone's not there,
Hmm.
I should be able to do anything. And I think similar models apply for these giant companies or even startups. Like a leader who has walked in everyone's shoes. Of course, they don't need to know about every single detail, but they should be able to understand how the actual work gets done.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's really critical. And the other way too, right? Like you want your team to understand, the pressures that are on leadership so they can contribute to it, right? The mantra or the mission of GitLab for a long time was everyone can contribute. And that was true. It's like everyone can contribute. And then we have this concept of a DRI where it's like, but this is the person that's the directly responsible individual to make the decision. And so, yes, everyone can contribute, but also balancing that with like this person's going to make the decision and we're all going to get behind them was like again was a really powerful way of operating.
Absolutely. So shifting gears towards Prefect. So when I check the website like prefect.io, it says like Pythonic orchestration for modern teams, which is a very nice, like catchy terms like Pythonic orchestration. I didn't exactly know what is Pythonic orchestrations, but I'd love to know like what is Pythonic orchestrations. And maybe a follow on that would be like, why do you think like orchestration is so critical for modern teams? And then
Yeah.
why Python for that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of great questions. Yeah, so Prefect is open source as well. It's an open source tool, and the goal is really to marry the business logic that data teams are writing to the right compute resources, making sure that like the code that they're writing gets the same compute when it needs it, and scaling up and down. So that sounds a little bit like a lot of things, right? Like that kind of makes this orchestration is kind of a very generic term, right? Like Kubernetes is an orchestrator. Like why does this exist? But this two things is the Pythonic nature and then the differentiated nature of what data teams need when it comes to orchestration. So um, the Python is the language of data science and of data engineering. Um, and rather than like having folks have to rewrite that code in some way, right? Whether that's to like fit into a specific DSL or a YAML or some sort of very specific DAG structure, the idea around Prefect is you just takes your Python code, wraps around it, and makes it production rate grade so that you can add things like retrying and monitoring and scheduling without having to like learn a whole new world, right? And so by staying Pythonic, it allows kind of the right separation of concerns, I would say, between like infrastructure teams and data teams, right? Because data teams are often kind of left behind or like kind of the last thought, right? Everybody, when we think of deploying infrastructure, we think of, application teams and we're going to deploy these Docker images to Kubernetes, da, 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 da. Great. Well, those are great for like long running applications, but data teams have this like very different need where some things might have to be batched, some things have to be scheduled to happen at certain times. Some things, might require specific kinds of compute for specific, use cases, right? We might need a massive set of GPUs to train a model, but then afterwards, a much different, lower kind of cost hardware to run it and productionize it. So that's kind of what Prefect helps to bridge is that gap and create the right level of separation where a platform team can deliver to data teams what they need with what they know, Kubernetes and those kinds of things, other, cloud native scaling, and the data teams can just do what they want to do, which is write Python, and then Prefect is kind of that bridge between the two.
And I like how we're reusing that abstraction. It's just one more layer of abstraction. Like even Kubernetes, it's the abstraction. So the
Mhm.
power of abstractions comes into play. I know you touched on like the choice between workflow engine versus CI/CD briefly, but I'd like to double click on that. How, let's say, an engineering team, they have heard about all these different tools. There's Harness CI/CD, GitHub Actions, GitLab, Workflow,
Mhm.
Airflow, Prefect. How do they choose about choosing a workflow engine for, let's say, there's data pipelines, they have CI/CD pipelines. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of as you specialize that those decisions become more critical, or that's where the it depends kind of comes in, right? I think if you're doing if you're doing basic anything, a tool many tools are useful, right? Like if you just want to run a pipeline one time, there's lots of tools you could choose off the shelf. Um, but if you want to deploy software, okay, now you've got to look at tools like a Harness or a GitLab CI/CD, a GitHub Actions, tools that are kind of more gained towards, hey, I have code that I want to get running in a production environment, right? Those tools are great for that. Um, and if you have a more specialized thing, like I was saying about data teams that have this more specialized, hey, I've got to run batch jobs and I've got to schedule stuff and I've got to do some maybe event-driven stuff and some schedule stuff and this kind of weird amalgam. And some of the stuff it has to be real time, right? Like most of the time, application developers are like, well, everything's real time. It's an application. Users are using it. Data teams is very different. It's like some stuff needs to be real time because, oh, this is a recommendation algorithm that's running that our application developers are actually hitting an API for, right? As people are on the website, versus this is model building that needs to happen, once a day or once a week, right? And so those kinds of differentiated use cases then start to say, okay, I need a more specialized tool that's really focused on what I'm doing, not just always kind of running the same pipeline. And so I think that's where the bifurcation comes. And I think I mean, I'm biased because I've come from the DevOps world, I'm in the data world. I think you need both, right? Like I think you should be using a CI/CD tool to deploy your code to where it needs to be to run it. But then I think you should use an orchestrator to actually schedule and run those jobs once they're live. So I think, for scenarios that require sophisticated scheduling, dependency management between tasks, like data-driven conditional logic, moving data between things, that's where you need like a data orchestrator. But if you need, to deploy, test, build, deploy, automate, that's where you need like a pipeline tool, like a Harness or a GitLab CI/CD. So I think most teams are doing both of those kinds of things that have a sophisticated data architecture, so they probably need both.
Yeah. And I'm wondering about the maturity model or the right time to choose these tools. So both of us have been like in the tech space for a long time, and we have seen teams battle between build versus buy. Like, should we
Yep.
buy this or like this is open source, so let's just build it. So it's not easy, by the way. So
Yeah.
then how do you choose when to, let's say, just build your own if you have an army
Mhm.
of engineers versus you buy something, you build something. Like, what's the balance here?
Yeah. I mean, I think the balance comes from, you know, what you are, it's like oversimplification, but like what are you paying your team to do, right? Like in many cases, what you're paying your team to do isn't to maybe go learn Kubernetes at a really deep level and deploy it to bare metal servers and get it running, right? Like you're paying your team instead to deliver an application to your end users, right? And so that's maybe the full range of like the what it would be. Like, oh, am I paying somebody to really learn Kubernetes, or am I paying someone to like deliver value to my customers? And it's a journey and it depends on the size of the team and the size of it, right? At some point, right? Like if all your people are paid to do this, then you should probably be buying a lot of off-the-shelf stuff and not building much of anything. But there's a trade-off time where you say, okay, now I've got to optimize the compute that I'm using in my cloud because yes, I'm delivering to a customer, but like some of this value comes from like how much am I spending to do that, right? Or oh, well, I have so many developers that are doing this that I need a team that's focused on their productivity, right? And now they're going to help, kind of build some tooling on top of what we might have to do that, right? Versus, oh, I am a hyperscaler, so I've got to understand Kubernetes inside and out, right? So I think it depends on where you are kind of on that journey and what the team's mission is, right? If the team's mission is to make get code delivered, then like you should probably not be building much of anything. If the team's mission is to make that team more efficient, okay, now you're talking about you might be building some more, abstraction layers, right, to your point, between that team and the compute to help them be more efficient at their job.
Totally agreed. Both on the point of mission, both of our mission have been to take what our engineers have been building and take it to the developer world. Work as a two-way feedback mechanism, tell the world that awesome tools and projects they're building, but also hear their feedback and then bring that back to the company and the product teams, which is typically called developer relations.
Mhm.
So on developer relations, a very controversial question. Do you think developer relation is still relevant to all teams or all companies, and especially in 2025, how it has changed
Mhm.
in the last 10, 15 years, like from the Twilio days? And then I have a
Yep.
follow-up after that.
Okay. Yeah, no, there's lots of controversial questions, and like if you've met me before, you know that I don't really shy away from them. I mean, yes, I think it is, right? Like and I think the reason is maybe the most controversial part of my opinion here, which is like, folks will ask like, where does developer relations belong? And I think developer relations at the end of the day is developer marketing, which like a lot of my fellow developer relations people might not like me saying that, but like it's true. Um, and I'm not, that doesn't mean that, but why is it not just like any other form of marketing? Well, it's because developer marketing is not like anything we traditionally think of in marketing, right? Like if you looked up marketing in the dictionary and looked at the definition, none of that fits with developer marketing. What developer marketing takes is understanding where developers are, meeting them where they are, and understanding their problems, and then applying a set of tools to those problems that may or may not result in commercial success, honestly, for your company, but should have a opinionated view of the world probably that matches what your company is trying to build. But that opinion doesn't is what developers are looking for, right? They want to understand, how are other people solving these problems? How can I solve this problem better? But they're going to evaluate that very directly, right? They're not going to evaluate that by reading. They're going to evaluate that by hands on keyboard. And so you need people there to help them understand that. And so I think developer relations is just as relevant today as it's ever been. I think you'll see companies that have completely decided, oh, it's not relevant and it's cut it out. Like I don't think you'll see those companies succeed in the long run. And I think the biggest companies that are successful right now are still very heavily invested in developer relations, and that is an example of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I phrase it as like, we're not in the business of selling shoes. If it was simple as selling shoes, then all I have to do is just say, like, this is our shoe, it bends, it's long lasting, it's affordable, buy our shoes. We're in the business of selling or providing complex products, like complex technical products. And the end user have to know how to use these products, and someone has to do it. You can use any title you want. You can even have the
Mhm.
CTO or CEO could do the work, but someone actually has to do the work of building the documentation, writing the content, creating videos so that those complex ideas can be consumed. So you can have your DevRel team do it. You can have one person, multiple person, but someone has to do that work.
Correct. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a really good point. Yeah, the title. Yeah, we can and always have debated the titles for forever, but the work has to happen. Yeah, it's like you are going to have to market to developers. You're going to have to show people how it works and why it's important to them. And without that, yeah, you're not going to succeed. So you're 100% correct.
Yeah, and one other common, like for maybe some listeners who haven't heard developer relations before or developer advocacy before, think of it as like Gmail versus Google Cloud. So if you're using Gmail, it's like a end user consumer product. You just open an account and you send emails. It's an email. But Google Cloud is what you use to build like software and applications. So of course, we can't expect everyone to know how to use Google Cloud, and that's why you need people who are engineers or who are still engineers to show other engineers on how to do that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good point. And Google Cloud has a massive developer relations team, right? Like for that very
Yes.
reason.
So I mentioned about the follow-up. The follow-up, and you like this follow-up, is about ROI, the other controversial part about developer relations, that where's your metrics? So you're saying that you give a talk and now we don't have 10 paying users for our product? How does it work?
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, I think I start with my theory that it is developer marketing, right? And then I apply kind of more traditional marketing terminology to it because I think it is at the awareness stage, right? For the most part, awareness and then education stage. And so because of that, I think that's why it's so hard. You cannot directly tie quickly and easily attribution to things that are awareness marketing plays, right? Like that's just kind of known if you ask any marketing MBA and they'll say, yeah, that's the that top of funnel is really hard to measure for. That's not to say you shouldn't measure for it, because I also think that we my next controversial take is that we as developer relations professionals got a little bit lazy, right? In a world where we had ZERP and we had like these massive startups that were growing so fast that we said, yeah, like developer relations is a given. So like I don't have to, prove the worth of it. Like that's not a great idea either. And that's, I think, what got us into the situation we are now, which is where folks are kind of like, wait, what is the value of developer relations? And so actually the first thing I've done at both of my leadership roles that I've taken since I left GitLab is establish this is how we're going to measure it. There's a really great article written about this that I'll share with your team that basically, talks about all the different ways you can measure it, contributions to GitHub or again, talks given, right? People that we've given talks to or views of a blog post. But I think that all of those things really roll up, and this makes the argument that I agree with, that it rolls up to how many people are using the tool, right? Monthly active developers, it calls it, right? And this is how GitHub measures developer relations too. It's like how many people are using the product monthly. That in the end is the thing that you're going to have to measure against, because if you agree with my theory that it's an awareness play, that means that things that you do will necessarily lead to more awareness, will lead to more adoption. So I think you have to measure that. Now, should you measure other things like how many people are viewing a vlog or how many people do you reach in a talk? Sure, yes, but you could easily overcorrect for those things. And so measuring as your kind of key performance indicator, monthly active developers is, I think, the only way that you can be successful. And we had this concept again at GitLab of key performance indicators and then performance indicators. So a key performance indicator is the one that you're really measuring yourself against and trying to push. But then you can have performance indicators that have like, oh, our theory is if we build up our YouTube subscriber base, or if we go to 14 conferences this year, that will lead to other outcomes. But you have to start, I think, with saying, hey, the key number we're going to look at is users.
And I think everyone can agree that you need to continuously improve process, and you can't improve something that you can't measure. And that goes not only for like talks or let's say blogs you write. It's even, let's say, if we have 20 different conferences we can go to, we can have a proven model with weight-based, like what's our target audience? Okay, how long is the distance? You have to travel to the other part of the world, and based on factors, you can rate out of 10 or 100 that if it doesn't meet those threshold, then it's a no. I think in the past, a lot of teams have burned by just traveling to all over the places, which might not relate to their end goal and company goal. And that's where the clash starts happen, that like, why did you spend $10,000 going to those conferences?
Yeah. It's very expensive to attend a conference or sponsor a conference. And so, yeah, 100% you've got to understand. And yeah, it might not be a dollar for dollar ROI that you can put on it. I mean, maybe it is if you're sponsoring, right? You're going to expect to get leads out of it. Now, that may or may not be the DevRel team. Ideally, it's not. But if you're going to attend a conference, you have to have, an outcome that you expect that is going to make it worth that investment, right? And I just think that's true anywhere, right? Like we had, sorry, to go back to GitLab again, but we had this concept called spend company money like it's your money. And so like on the spending company money page, that was rule number 1. And then rule number 2 was no really. And that sounds like a free-for-all, but it's really not, right? Like what it means is like, hey, would you spend your money to go do this thing? If it was your money, would you spend it because you think it's valuable enough to do, right? That makes you kind of make that connection, right? And so I think that's a connection that we all have to like think through, and to your point, like have a plan for before we just go and spend $10,000 to go to a conference.
Totally. And I think whether it's conference or events, one thing that's deeply tied to that is community. Like, what are the communities targeted? And you have been heavily involved in open source communities, both at GitLab in project discovery. How would you say that if someone wants to build a sustainable community, or maybe even join another community, what would that look like?
That's a great question, and it's one that you get asked all the time. I think part of the beginning is it's hard to you can't manufacture it out of nothing, as much as you'd love to do that. And so I think the number one, right, the most successful open source communities, what do they start from? They started from people solving a problem that they had, right? Like, again, bias a little bit, but let's talk about Git, like not GitLab, but the open source project Git. Like, where did that come from? Well, Linus Torvald was developing Linux and needed source control that worked for teams that were distributed, right? And at the time, he was using one that went proprietary and then built, legend has it in a weekend, Git, right? And why did it take off? Well, it's because he was solving a problem that a lot of people had and solving his own problem at the same time. And I think if you look at any successful open source community, you'll find the same thing, right? At Prefect, our CEO and co-founder and our CTO co-founder, like they had problems with, how do I operationalize all this data science that I'm doing, right? And it's hard, and I don't want to learn another DSL and put it into like some sort of crazy structure. I want to make it simple for people and just use Python, right? They solved the problem for themselves. So that's step one. And then once you've got that and you have a little bit of a momentum where you can say, oh, people are, do have this problem and are using it, there's lots of ways that you can then sustain and grow it, right? So I think the number one thing that's really underestimated for people is just acknowledging folks' contributions to the community, whether that's through code or a lot of other ways. Like people really underestimate the value of acknowledging people's contributions. Early on in my tenure at Project Discovery, my tenure here, like my number one goal was to like go out and meet people in the community. And we had this one person who's like, oh, I'm just a student. Like they were very confused why I was contacting them. But I was like, no, you wrote this great thing. You showed this example of using Prefect. Like, that's amazing. Like, thank you. And I'd love to meet you and say hi. And like, just doing that had this massive impact on that person who then now they're like really active in our Slack community and they're, sharing more things. It's like that kind of leveraged kind of work only comes when you're willing to actually acknowledge what other people are doing, right? Because they're taking time out of their day to spend time in your community. So I think that's really the number one thing, and I think that has a compounding impact. There's lots of like tactical things I could talk about after that, but I think that's the number one.
And as, let's say, maintainers, people want to see like contributions, as you say, like reaching out to the student and encouraging them to contribute more. But it can also sometimes create some sort of overwhelming effect where you're like a few maintainers or few leads of these open source projects or communities, and you're bombarded with requests. So how would you say the challenges or reality of these burnouts, and what are some of the ways to resolve those?
Yeah, I mean, if I had all the answers, I'd be doing something different. But I think that the number one thing is eventually you have to have an opinion about what a project is and isn't, right? And that ranges for a lot of things. Like that it applies to the technical side, right? Like this is going to solve this set of problems. It's not going to solve this set of, and like you just have to be okay with that and kind of stating that, and it's okay. Like you don't have to you can't make everyone happy all the time. And so because of that, you have to choose like to focus on the things that you really do want to solve with a given project, right? Like I think And then just being really clear and nice. You don't have to be mean about it, but you just have to say, hey, we're not going to do this because like this is going to be outside the scope of what we want to do for this project. Like you're welcome to take it and build it on top of it, but like we're never going to accept this as a contribution because it's just not something we're looking to add. I think that's the number one thing to do. It's just to kind of really handle the scope of the project well. And then after that, I think you have to have, you know, a code of conduct and community guidelines that are really clear and enforced, right? Like, because I think it's okay for folks to be excited about your project and want to contribute and want to have it do more for them. That's great. But it's not okay for that to turn into like a toxic relationship where this person is like not happy and making the rest of the community miserable, making you as a maintainer miserable. Like you need to have guardrails in place that really make it clear that you're not going to accept that kind of negativity or you know the wrong kind of contributions. And then lastly, I think, you know, again, the going to scope, it's like you have to be really clear with people. Like, is this a side project that, yeah, I'm going to get to every now and again, or is this something that I am trying to build into something bigger? And then people should have expectations that align with that. So I think those are kind of the key things.
Totally agreed. And as you're like in the early days of your open source communities, like the people you're working with, like they can be your champions, like the active contributors, let's say only few maintainers, they don't have to take on all the work. They can delegate, and an active community means that other people are also responding to threads. And besides like the code of conduct you mentioned, people can take use from those tools like Stalebot. Like you have a bunch of issues, those are old issues. You don't have to go and close it yourself. There are like other tools out there to help you.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right, switching gears to personal and work life. So a data of four, I believe.
Yeah.
How do you balance a high profile tech career and your family?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, I think I learned a lot at GitLab about this too. Because we had a saying there that it's family and friends first, work second. And I think you kind of have to have that attitude eventually in your life. I have not had it my entire life. Like I say that I'm an in recovery workaholic, right? Um, and in developer relations and in open source, that's like very easy place to feed that demon, right? Because there's always something more to do. There's always another issue that somebody's opening. There's always, you know, another thread to read. And so I think that, you know, for me, it has been first accepting that there's always going to be something more to do at work, and two, I've got to put, you know, the family first, because with four kids, it's like really like kind of not an option, right? There's just too much to do for me to be, you know, disconnected from that, and you know, it means that I'm, you know, I kind of have embraced what I call like a non-linear workday. So I'll, you know, at 3:30, my kids get home from school. I won't work from 3:30 to 4:30 maybe, right? But I may come back at you know 8:30 and do something if I want to, or I won't, right? It just means that I've, you know, found ways to kind of fit work into my life rather than the other way around. Now, having said that, you have to have leadership support for that, right? So like it's going to matter who you work for. Our CEO, he's got four kids as well, which is helpful. But he picks up. He has, you know, a couple days a week that he's doing school pickup, right? And so he's like, I'm again at 3 o'clock. I'm not going to be around for a couple hours. And so that kind of, you know, sets a tone, I think, for a business. And so you've got to, if you're a leader, you need to set that tone really clear, and not just. I think the key thing for leaders here is not just doing it, but like being really public about it. We had a CRO at GitLab who again had small children, and now we're in the pandemic era. And for those folks that had children during the pandemic, you became like also like substitute teacher, right? Because school was at home. And our CRO, right? We're this high growth startup that's got to hit numbers, right? Like, you know, sales numbers, as everyone knows at a startup, are always like, you know, the number one thing. But the CRO at the time would say, hey, I'm going to be off this afternoon because I got to do homework with the kids, right? And he would say that in a public channel, like on Slack. And that makes such a huge difference because then people can see and absorb, oh no, this is the way I should live my life, right? Sid, the CEO, would say, if you're the one that works at GitLab, you should be the one picking up the kids from school, right? Like you got to have that mentality from the top down. And so if you're a leader, you need to lead with that. And if your leaders aren't supportive of that kind of balance, like that's it's going to be hard. But you can try to lead from the ground up, or you can try to find a leader that does support you.
A lot of valuable insights and fantastic lessons. If you want to sum up what we discussed today for our listeners, like three key takeaways they could take from you, and you can say like from your combined years of experience in working in tech, what would be some lessons be?
Yeah. Again, I think writing things down is a superpower, right? I wrote about it when I left GitLab as the thing I didn't want to forget. And I think that applies to a lot of things, right? That applies to having work-life balance, right? Like if I write something down, I know it exists. It applies to how our open source community is going to work together, right? Like that writing things down, in GitHub or GitLab, wherever you're collaborating is really critical. And then it also helps your decision making, right? We talked about the decision-making process of like, how do I choose a tool, right? I think, again, writing things down can really help articulate to the team why we're choosing to build versus buy, for instance. So I think that's the one thing that I would say, like write more things down. It's going to help you out a lot. And then, like, again, I think the other takeaway would be, giving trust and agency to your team if you're a leader. If you've hired people because they're smart people, let them go do their job, give them ownership over decisions, trust them to spend their time and money wisely, enable them to work flexibly. I think that builds loyalty better than any other incentive that you can offer people, and it's going to make them, that much more efficient.
Couldn't agree more. Uh, For folks who are listening or watching this, please start your personal blog if you don't have one already. When I started my personal blog, one of the best decisions I made, as Brandon shared, like write more. You can't write enough. And I think once you have your own blog, sharing your own thoughts, not only you can look back, but other people who are in your shoes, they can read from your experience and learn. I'm pretty sure people would love to like connect to you. They'll learn more about your work and get involved with the projects you're part of. How they can do that?
Yeah, so I'm at O'Leary Crew, most places on the internet, or you can get to my website, which is BOleary, so BOLEARY.dev. That's my blog, and then it also has all the links to Blue Sky and Twitter X and all the other places you can find me.
Sounds fantastic. Thanks so much, Brandon, for joining ShipTalk podcast. We'll link all the links you mentioned in the video description or in the podcast. This was ShipTalk podcast, and we had a fantastic episode learning from Brandon's experience working in product strategy, working in developer relations, sharing his insights about open source, as well as how to strike a balance between family and work. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.